Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Miranda if you're new here. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'm going to be discussing a couple of tips and advice that I've learned throughout the years on how to create very saturated and vibrant paintings using acrylic paint. Ever since I started sharing paintings on social media a few years ago, and as I've kind of built that online presence, people have been asking me since the beginning, how do I create such saturated paintings? How do I create such vibrant colors using acrylic paint? People struggle with the blendability of acrylic paint. People struggle with it not being muddy. So I finally feel like I've learned enough over the years. I've trialed and errored enough things on my own in my own experience to know what really works best for me. To begin, I'm going to talk about my canvases. I feel like I'm going to be going kind of in the order of preparing your canvas to painting, so just bear with me on that. So my tip number one, I personally love, and I always do this, I always sandpaper and prime my canvases before I paint. The reason I do this is because I find that the texture of the canvas, you know, there's little ridges on cotton canvas. I find that I do not like that. I do not like how it interferes with blending my acrylic paint. And even when it comes to when your painting is dried, I don't like personally the way that it looks. I kind of like it to look almost like a photo. Like you can't tell if it's a photo or if it's a painting because like it's so smooth. So that's what I do personally. I use 150 grain sandpaper, just any fine sandpaper will work. This is the kind that you can get at the art store. And then after I sandpaper it, I do a layer of gesso. And then I will most likely sandpaper it again and do another layer of gesso. I tend to do it twice to really create a smooth surface. Sometimes after my last layer of gesso has dried, I will sandpaper the surface again because the dried gesso can leave its own texture. So sometimes I will sandpaper it again. But yeah, that's my advice number one that has really helped me throughout the years. It especially helps when it comes to blending acrylic paint because we all know it's not as easy to blend as, say, oil paint or even gouache paint. Okay, my tip number two would be to educate yourself on your brushes and your paint. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, to start with paint, there are all different types of acrylic paint. There are all different types of gouache paint. Some acrylic paint has a gloss finish to it. Some acrylic paint has a matte finish to it. There are heavy body acrylic paints. There's all different types of paints. One thing that I kind of had to force myself to do a couple of years ago was to just educate myself on my paints and my brushes because there is so much products that you are buying. When it comes to brushes, there are all different types of brushes, and each brush shape is unique, and each brush shape performs differently and does different things on the canvas. A filbert brush is going to be different than a mop brush, and that's going to be different than a liner brush. So just take a little bit of time to educate yourself. You don't need to be a master at knowing these things, but it will help you in the long run if you just take a little bit of time to learn about the products that you're using. My next tip is to allow for contrast and negative space to exist in your painting. I'm going to use an example of a painting that I recently created that has a lot of highlights and a lot of shadows in it. As you can see, I have already put down a layer of white gesso on this painting to allow the white space to exist. As I am putting in my first sketch, my first layer of paint, I am being very meticulous as to where I am placing my black, as to make sure that I am not placing it anywhere that I want to put a highlight. If I do this, it will immediately darken the highlight. It will not look the same from that point on. Most of the white space that is in this painting was literally from that first layer of gesso. It's not even painted on top of. My last tip kind of feeds into this next tip, which is don't layer your dark colors under your highlighted colors where you want the highlights to be. When it comes to acrylic paint, it is a layering process. You are layering color on top of color on top of color versus oil paint where you're pretty much just blending one layer of the paint. So it's really important when it comes to acrylic paint to make sure that you do not put to be. It just generally will not make the highlight as strong, and it's just gonna throw off the contrast and the depth of the entire piece. My next tip, I believe it's tip 6, on how to create vibrant and saturated colors using acrylic paint is to clean your palette and to change your water often. I especially apply this rule to gouache paint because gouache paint is a lot more watery and your colors will mix so easily. Especially when I'm using dark shades versus highlight shades, like shadows versus highlights, I always clean my palette off. I always change the water because that will affect how your paint colors turn out in the end. So make sure to clean your palette off often and to change your water consistently. My next tip is to always use a palette knife to mix your colors and to not use a brush. There is always, pretty much, after you use a brush for the first time, there's always going to be some residue of paint left on the brush, no matter how hard you clean it. I mean, unless you're like an insane person with cleaning your brushes every time. I know I'm not, but there's always going to be some residue of paint on your brushes. So if you're using a brush to mix a color, you're automatically going to get some muddying going on with the color that's residual on your paintbrush already. When it comes to a palette knife isn't porous. It will not absorb any paint. And it wipes off easily, it cleans so easily, and you're also not wasting paint because, like I said, your paintbrush isn't absorbing any of that paint. The best way to get saturated colors is to always use a palette knife to mix your colors. All right, we are getting into the last couple of tips that I have for you guys on how to create saturated paintings using acrylic paint. So my second last tip is to try using secondary and tertiary colors as your highlight shades, or to mix into your highlight shades. Using these kinds of shades will allow your painting to really pop. It's not essential, like I said, but just using the primary colors, it really doesn't allow for a lot of vibrance to exist. It's just, I find that it can be a lot more surreal and romanticized if you use these colors like cyan or magenta, hot pink, these kinds of shades to use in your highlight shades. It really will just add for a more fun palette. I mean, it's really just a way to make for a more exciting painting. I encourage you guys to try it. Don't be afraid of the color. Don't be afraid of what could happen, right? Like, you might try something and knew that you were scared of, and it might be colors as a highlight shade, or to use in your palette to mix in with your highlight shades to really make it pop. All right, we are on the last tip on how to create colorful and saturated paintings using acrylic paint. My last tip is honestly the most important. It was the thing that took me the longest to do, and it doesn't just have to do with colors or paintbrushes, it has to do with like your self-esteem. So my last tip is do not overpaint. Do not ruin the work that you already worked on by thinking that, oh, it could be better, or I could just add one thing and it'll look better. Worse, and then we end up wasting more hours just trying to fix what was already perfect in the beginning. This kind of ties into my last, well, not my last point, but one of my points before, where I was showing you my icy waterfall painting, where I was putting down the first layer and how I allowed the negative space to exist. I just left the first layer. That's kind of where I'm getting at. You don't need to be perfect. Most of the time, your first ideas are the best ideas. So don't overpaint. I literally used to spend so long on paintings because I was a perfectionist. I was obsessed with making everything perfect, and I would just end up making it worse, to be honest. So that's my last tip. Don't overpaint. If something looks good, don't try to make it perfect, because to be honest, the eye, you know, when people are looking at your paintings, they're not looking at the details. You are, because you've been looking at your painting for weeks or however long you've been working on it. You've been looking at it and obsessing over what isn't right. But I believe truly that when someone looks at your painting for the first time, perfections that you did. So that's my last tip, and those are all of my tips on how to create colorful and saturated paintings using acrylic or gouache paint, just acrylic-based paint in general. I hope this video was helpful for you guys. I'm gonna be creating more tip videos like this in the future. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like the video, leave a comment below, subscribe, all of that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.